I'll just give a brief introduction. I'm Nikunj Nirmal. I work with Tech Mahindra, and I manage one of the tier 1 US telco accounts for my company. And I've been in project management, program management, Agile, DevOps for a long time. And I'd just like to share some of the challenges that I have seen and would like to hear from you as well. Would like to make this very interactive so that we all learn from each other's experiences. But that transformation could be really painful. That's all I have to summarize to start with. So this is something, well, we have all the experts over here, so you all know what I'm talking about. But the traditional view of how things were in project management or how we execute all the programs and projects. The problem over here is that, and it's necessarily not a problem, it depends on the type of project we are doing. Some of them are best suited still in the traditional style. But some of the issues we have seen while executing the projects which have dynamic change of requirements. So essentially, this has its origin in the classic manufacturing and construction industries where things are pretty sequential. You know the specifications up front. This is what you are trying to build at the very start of the project. And it's quite a lot of things is repetitive. So the learnings are applicable from one cycle to another. We are not really trying to do a lot of new things from project to project. Right? Whereas the scenario, especially for IT, has changed. The same principles may not be fully applicable over here, and that's where I think the organizations are trying to make a change, explore different methodologies. Agile was very popular, and now DevOps is coming up. And I think a lot of organizations have already adopted that. In companies such as Google, we see that it's no longer the standard rules are not applicable. They only have a product engineer who does everything. Right? So the classic IT organization structure, the classic structure for the business also that interacts with IT is changing now. It's all getting merged into one single role. And what it means for project managers and individuals is that one single expertise or one single role is no longer applicable. We all need to evolve. We all need to learn new skills. And it goes all the way from project managers, developers, production support guys, environment folks, all of them. Everything is getting clubbed into a single role kind of, or into a single org at least. So again, as I said, there are still several projects where I at least believe that the traditional approach is better. But given some of the new ways of working, I think there are a few challenges that I have observed, and I would definitely like to hear from you as well, anything else that you have observed working on the classic, so to say, SDLC process. Right. Our standard approach to project management as per PMP is sequential. So it becomes really difficult to make changes along the cycle. The later you make the changes, it's that more cost. Looking at it, so it's difficult to make changes. Next phase is completely dependent on the previous stage. And we are not really doing a lot of iterations in the classic cycle. There is a lot of inflexibility. It is partitioned into predefined phases. And that phases are again dissolving. The boundaries are dissolving right now. And it's really difficult to respond to changes. If we are already down in the development cycle and the requirement change comes, to go all the way back to solution architecting, we have to go again back to designing, then the changes come in. There is a change management process that kicks in. All in all, what we are trying to do is start that small piece again from the front and go through the entire process. And that could increase the cost, push the timelines, we all know that. I said that I believe there are still certain projects where the classic cycle or the classic approach is more befitting, and that is where I would say that the requirements are very clear. We know for sure it's repeatable. We know for sure there is not going to be any change. We can still go with this approach, and I think that fits the best. We are trying to, in the classic cycle, again, we are trying to do a big design upfront. That again keeps changing. For the projects, or for if you're trying to build a new platform or a product, and that development itself can last for more than a year or two. I'll give you a recent example. We are building an order management platform, and during that cycle, within 1 year, we have changed the platforms, the technologies so often, because the organization decides we don't want to work with this particular company anymore. We don't want to use their licenses, do something else. already done the design, go back, do everything again. That's not really working out very well. And a part of this project actually was working in an Agile. Now that is, again, not good. Part of it is Agile, part of it is not. But again, that part was still less impacted, we saw, when this change came along. And there is a high cost of failure. Again, later you identify the problem, the more cost you will incur. And another aspect is learnings are applicable to the next project. So when you are done with this project, you would have a set of learnings you will apply to the next project. But it's really difficult to apply those learnings within the project. That is more critical. That would reduce the chances of failure. So I want to do this in 2 steps. For transitioning over, again, this is purely my opinion, but from transitioning over directly from a traditional development approach to DevOps, I think is a big leap. Should rather be done in phases. Try to go to Agile first, and then move on to DevOps. Yes?
So I'm not familiar with DevOps as it's discrete from Agile. Can you go back a few steps?
Sure.
That, please?
OK. So Agile is a part of DevOps. Let me put it that way. Agile development has evolved further, and it's now integrating. So in Agile, we are focused on certain aspects, right? It's more of development to test, requirements development test. But in case of DevOps, we are also integrating the operations. So it's not just a delivery of the project, but we are integrating the operations back into that same cycle. Okay. That's the basic high-level design to that. And there's a lot of automation, a lot of tools that come into play when you go with DevOps. And it's still a 1 step further change in the philosophy of how you think about your operations, your project, your business. Any other points? OK. So when you want to transition to Agile, and interestingly, I was a part of the Agile transformation in a very large company. And I remember the day when I was a part of the first experimental pod, so to say. It was very interesting with the types of questions I and my team came up with the Agile coaches. And we had solid doubt this cannot be done in this structure where we are. There's so many external dependencies. We are doing the IST in a release cycle. We are doing the testing in a release cycle. We have a UAT. How does it all work? We're just trying to do a part of it Agile. Right? So we had our own doubt. So what I learned is, first of all, embrace the change. It's coming. We need to welcome it, and rather than trying to figure out why it won't work, try to see how we can make it work. And that's a philosophical or a mindset change. I learned it a little hard way, I would say. Training plan. So when we talk of Agile, what I hear from my friends as well is organizations typically want their IT departments to be Agile. That's not how it works. The whole organization has to be Agile. So the training plan has to address all the stakeholders in the organization. We cannot have one part of the whole chain in an Agile form. It doesn't work very well. It's a collaborative process. The reason we are trying to go Agile is that it's a collaborative process. I started talking about Agile. I assume that everyone is aware of Agile. Anybody wants me to talk about or give a preface to Agile? My apologies. Yeah. It's not SDLC, it's more of a collaboration that we are trying to do along with the DevOps. So, and I'll come to that in detail later, but essentially what we are trying to say, so it's the operation folks are involved during the development cycle as well, so that there is more collaboration. You think about what will happen in operations. So in the traditional cycle, what really happens is the developers are focused just on their development code. They don't really think a lot, maybe a few, but most of them I have interacted with, they don't really think how it will work in operations. So there is another phenomenon going on right now, which is called performance first. I just had one of my team members create a nice paper on that. Traditionally, what we do is we do the development. Everything is done. Maybe the functional test is done, and then we do the performance test. Some of the things can be resolved technically, but some of it cannot be resolved technically. you need to go back to the requirements. You are trying to put too much of data into one page. It cannot be loaded in 5 seconds. It will take 15 seconds, no matter what you do. No matter how fast machines you used, no matter how much of caching you do, it doesn't work that way. So that should go all the way back. So with DevOps, we are trying to integrate that entire approach. So you have the entire collaboration, and these things don't come up at the end of it. Right? I'm talking more about IT operations, production support, environments, etc. But yes, it does philosophically go back to even the business operations, because this would eventually affect your business operations as well. Let's take an example. If you have a call center rep, and he is used to seeing a bunch of data on a single screen, right? Now if you see that with some new systems, you cannot do that, no matter what you do. It means that you will probably have to have maybe a lazy loading kind of approach, or you maybe have to divide that information across into different screens. I'm talking at a very raw level over here, right? It is affecting your business operations in a way. So yes, since business stakeholders are a part of this, it does extend out to business stakeholders as well, yes.
So you're saying operations is involved in the entire iteration?
Yeah.
So does that mean your operations representatives are part of your project development team?
They may or may not be directly a part of it. Recommended, yes. But if we don't have enough work for them, then I personally wouldn't recommend them. But they have to be involved in the design. They have to be involved upfront. When I say, see, typically, let's look at an example. We have a separate production support team, right? Most of the organizations, as far as I know, have that structure. They come into at a very late stage when you are trying to deploy into production. The problems that they would face, or let's not even look at business operations, let's look at IT operations. When you are trying to troubleshoot an issue, there is an outage. You see there are no logs, or the logs are not written properly. How are those folks going to actually go and troubleshoot the issue? Right? But if they are in there upfront, they will have their own suggestions. So that's the approach I would.
But in a traditional model, I would just call that bad stakeholder management, right? Sorry.
Yeah.
In a traditional model, right, because you're comparing this to a traditional waterfall model, right, I would call that bad stakeholder management, right? My stakeholder is the operations team that's going to support this application. That's one stakeholder that's going to support this application when I put it in, right? So when I'm designing it, I should involve them so that they say, okay, I make sure we get all the error codes, right? And so that I can inform that. And so it's not, I don't view it necessarily as a gap in the traditional model. I view it as a gap in the application of appropriate already existing knowledge areas in the traditional model. Do you?
I agree with you, but DevOps makes you do it. So it changes the design, right? So right there with you on that, yeah. But this is by design helps you do that, so not everyone does the job great. So this kind of changes that structure in a way, yeah.
That's fair.
Okay. Did I answer your question? I've seen one more hand go up somewhere there. Sorry, I missed who was. Okay. So going back to Agile, now, yeah, I was talking about we should have a proper training plan at all levels in the organization. Everyone needs to be, and not everyone needs the same type of training. Whatever is applicable to that particular organization, if it's business, it's IT, it's senior leadership, everyone needs to be aligned on the same page how it really works. As I said, with my own experience, we had a lot of concerns on how it will work. We eventually figured out we were the experimental pod, so we had to figure out a lot of things on our own. But of course, the following pods and others were able to make it easy for themselves, right? Now, there was no proper communication why we were doing it. Agile is good, everyone knows, okay, so we have to do it. Is it that? What are we trying to achieve? So there was no proper communication coming out of it. And I think that customization, so to say, to at least start with to make the transition smoother wasn't there. We're just trying to go from one place to another without taking the route in a way. So that's where I thought that the next point where we say start with hybrid approaches. Now what I mean by that is when you talk about people trying to estimate in points, just for those people who don't know, for Agile, you don't really use the number of hours for estimation. You use the complexity points. You look at the user story. Let me step back. So write an epic. This is what you're trying to achieve. You break that down into different user stories. This is what you are trying to achieve. And then for each story, the team members, typically the size of 7 to 10 folks in an Agile team, would try to rate the stories. And the way it works is people would, if there is a large discrepancy, I give 0.2 to one story and someone else gives 0.8 or 10, it means that there is a difference in understanding. So we talk it out, do another round of voting in a way, and come to a proper agreement. So we are talking about a different approach to the estimation, and it may be difficult. So my recommendation would be we use hours just to start with, makes people more comfortable about it, and then go back to the proper Agile way. Another big change is the global delivery teams. Now, the way Agile is designed, it says that you have to be co-located, you work together. I remember I was asked to go to a different building to sit to the team and everything. But then we have people sitting across in a different country. How do we integrate them? So the training plans should address that. I worked on that plan. How do we integrate the offshore teams? There were a couple of models. If interested, I can go into details on that as well. But at a high level, what I figured was, one is a time zone difference. So work out your Scrum meetings at a particular time. There has to be a very good collaboration, so use good collaboration tools. We actually use video conferencing frequently. That increases the collaboration. Communication channels are the key over here. So as long as we have those in place, it can never be as close as working face-to-face, but this is the reality. We have global delivery teams, and there are hybrid models we can use to even include those teams within our group. And I have seen that we have also done completely offshore delivery teams where the Scrum Master is also offshore, which means that the business owner responsibility increases in transferring that communication knowledge back and forth. And there is a change in the team or the organizational structures. So traditionally, there are business analysts. Again, this is my experience, and it could vary across the board. There are business analysts, then you have the product owners who are giving the requirements. These guys are capturing the requirements, passing it on to dev, et cetera, from there on. But in case of Agile, we really go in an integrated way, in a collaborative way, where the product owner becomes the part of the group, and that story formation is in an iterative way. They are part of the group, directly talking to the developers. It's kind of, again, bridging the boundaries. And it becomes very easy. The communication barriers are, in a way, broken down. Plus, what we are trying to do is give a product sample or an output of the first iteration, for example, or first sprint to the user. So it's dynamic, trying to get a feedback, look at, this is what you asked us to do, this is what we did. Is it right? Is it what the expectation was? But no, it wasn't. Change a few things. That becomes a part of the next sprint's user story. So it kind of becomes iterative. And business owners, product owners become the part of the development process in a way. So the probability of finding the defects or major defects at the end, which changes everything, becomes lesser and lesser. And that's what I mean by change in the team or the org structures over here, because when we do this, people are getting out of their comfort zones. Again, I'm talking about transition. If there's a new organization, you are starting it off, it's easy. What I'm talking about is transition, especially for large organizations, from this to this. And actually, I've also seen that in one of the groups, the business and IT were moved under IT. So just to make it clear. Another part is, again, this is something, just a little detail. On the right side bottom, what you see is the Agile Manifesto. I'm pretty sure most of us would have read this. I'll not read through this, but it's out there. Essentially, what we are trying to do is, as I said earlier, we have an epic. Then we have features which we identify in the epic that we want to address. And then we go with a minimal marketable feature, which means that this is enough work to do in one sprint. This is just enough. And that's where the involvement of business is really necessary to identify that MMF, as we say. And then you further break down those two stories and other WBS and et cetera, et cetera. So we are trying to break down a larger chunk of work into smaller chunks, try to deliver that into typically 2-week sprints, and have it validated with business owners. Going back, it's an iterative process. And that's how with different stories, different sprints, we're trying to address that entire requirement. It definitely increases the speed to market. And with certain product companies, it becomes very easy for them to push the changes, incremental changes. I don't know if you have observed, but Facebook on your mobile device, you have one update every 2 weeks. They're actually pushing out the changes into production every 2 weeks, essentially, right? So that's the speed to market. Traditional approach is any changes go through a long process. Before I move on to this transformation, again, the next step, as a phase 2, I say Agile to DevOps. Any aspects, any questions around Agile itself that I can address right now?
Yeah, I have a question about connecting into what I would call downline systems. So when you're talking about 2-week sprints and you're kicking out workable code for the business to test, do you run into issues with connections into downline systems that may or may not be working that causes your 2-week sprint to be something that falls into the next sprint because the downline system won't be working for another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks?
Right, and that does definitely happen. That's where I said that with larger organizations where you have a lot of dependencies, this transformation is very difficult. I said I manage one of the large tier 1 telco accounts over here, and what I observed over there is there are lots of billing systems at the back. What we are trying to do is just a digital front for the customers, right? We're talking to like hundreds of systems out there. So that was the challenge when I said that when I was part of the first pod, and we were at the last step where we're trying to just build the user interface at the end. But there is billing, account management, lots of systems we are talking to. How is it going to work? So the answer is it's not perfect. We ended up doing a hybrid approach, and that has transitioned a little better. And eventually, what we did was partially address that, because there are billing releases that happen. So that requires a complete org change. That did not happen. But if that happens, then yes, what would happen is your first set or your backend systems would have a 2-week sprint that would deliver the features that you need for the next sprint. So essentially, it's just that they plan in advance. If this system needs this, so this will come here, this would come here. Your system would probably 5th or 6th that would get affected. But that's how the planning happens. That does reduce the time to market, but it's still, you are doing an incremental push rather than waiting for 3 or 4 months to do that push. So, but yes, if you have more dependencies, you still need more planning. But it's still addressable, maybe not very perfectly, but still it's possible to do that. And we ended up doing the same thing. We actually had spawned a separate pod which would focus on just the backend dependencies and working through that, making sure that their further dependencies are addressed. So we wanted to hit the ground running. We had to wait for a few weeks to even do our first stuff. But eventually that could get ironed out. And it will take a while to settle down. It won't be easy, but if you're making that transformation, wait for a few months, it can be done.
But you would identify those requirements up front, too.
Yes, so
You would know ahead of time what interfaces and what applications you would need in order to deliver this.
correct. So, but again, the difference would be that if you are trying to, typically we used to package maybe 10 features in one release. Instead of that, you would start pushing out one feature at a time. If you're trying to do 10 features in a release, what would happen is, and this is an actual example. There's a billing release, which means all the backend systems align. 3 months, they would have a release. We start after that. They would push in 10 features. We start developing 10 features after that. Instead of that, what we are saying is 15 days, let them develop one feature. We start working on that. So it goes out in a month versus waiting for 10 features. So incremental breaking down the stuff is only way to go. But we still need to identify those. It's just that if they have more dependencies, it will take more time. But when you break it down, total time to market is still faster. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Now, why did DevOps come into picture? This is my take: to reduce and reuse, reduce waste and recycle. Focus more on the product than processes. And that's one of the manifestos of Agile as well. Do what is minimal in requirement in terms of processes. Don't focus a lot on processes, just do the minimal required documentation. Right? And shifting left. What does it mean? One of the way to shift left is we are trying to do one feature into production sooner than the others. So we are shifting the entire cycle left. Also, what we are trying to do is we're trying to integrate the testing and the development cycles. So essentially, our development cycle also shrinks a little bit. That way, we are trying to do shift left. There are interesting tools, simulators that we use, and that would partially address the problem that was raised, dependencies on the backend system. One way to resolve that is simulators where you can actually stub the data points, and from front end, you don't go all the way to back end. There are simulators just sitting in between that record the live traffic from the previous operations. And then if the backend system is still not ready, you can still do your work. At the end, you will just have one sprint which integrates everything. So you can still do the development without those being in there. And from a coding perspective, you would see no difference. You wouldn't even know that there are simulators sitting in between. So that way it's still, but there would be an additional cycle just for integration, which you could still run into issues, but again, overall time is faster. So that's, again, one more way to shift left the things. Okay. So I'll quickly go through the cycle that is mentioned over here. We have inception, where, of course, the planning happens, and you plan, code, build, test, release, etc. So DevOps essentially addresses the entire set of operations, right from inception all the way to deployment and productions. But there are certain parts to it, and these are certain industry terms that we use. We call it continuous delivery. What this means is, again, so Agile is an integral part of this cycle. You do continuous delivery, which means it's kind of automated. So automation is a big part of DevOps. Build the code, push it to your repository, and a build would be pushed. There would be automation built in for testing, whatever. It's still difficult to put 100% of automation in testing, but whatever you can automate, and then directly through automated tools, push it out to release. Continuous integration addresses the aspects till the build and partially to deploy. And then you have agile development, which is focused partially up to testing. Right? Again, the way you look at it, sometimes it's a hybrid approach. This is kind of an example based on my observation. Typically, what I've seen is when you're trying to go from Agile to DevOps, you develop, you check in the code, you automate the build, you automate the code inspection. When I say automate the code inspection, it means using the tools for code quality, security, right in the integration cycle. Do a manual deployment. There is service virtualization, which I have seen being used even today, even though it's not Agile or DevOps. In a traditional model also, I have seen a lot of simulation used. You have manual testing, UAT, end-to-end, et cetera, and then to go into production. Right? So I've tried to build some animation in over here. Again, going from this to DevOps, I would recommend to do in phases. So the first phase is where you implement test-driven development. What do you mean by test-driven development? Traditionally, again, I think this varies, but traditionally, most of the developers write their test scenarios or the test cases after the development is done. What test-driven development is, you focus on how would you test it right up front. Look at the requirements, try to figure out what, so relate directly to requirements even before you start the development. And then you develop to satisfy the test cases. That way it is ensured that there's a better understanding of the requirements and your focus is different. Also, some of the systems, again, coming from a large organization, I've seen that there's a lot of dependency on test data. You're dependent on multiple systems, you need the test data upfront. If you don't have it, the testing suffers. To create the test data itself in hundreds of back-end dependent systems, it becomes difficult. So for that, if you look at the TDD approach, you are identifying the test cases upfront, and with that, you know what test data do you need. Request goes in upfront, you have it on time. There's no delay. Otherwise, at least I have seen that it delays the testing cycles, integrated testing cycles to a great extent. Okay. Then you check in the code. There's an automated build, which I assumed in the first place was there in the partial implementation. If it is not there, that needs to be done first. Then you have the automated code inspection. You do the configuration. There's a deployment that happens. And I talked about TDD. One more interesting way to do this is a model-based testing. So what I made my model-based testing is you have the flow charts and diagrams. There are tools available, Conformic IQ, and a couple of other tools, which help you do this. You have those defined up. I think fitness is, again, one of those tools, if I'm not wrong. So define those scenarios upfront, and those scenarios are transferred to test cases directly. And some tools go to the extent of creating automated test scripts from your test tool. So in a way, you're automating that entire process, which is, you don't even have to write automation scripts or just modify some of the scripts. That makes it very fast and less prone to manual error. Looking at this, and then you go to end-to-end test, again, use the model-based testing over there for regression. Because again, some of the cases, so typically in a testing cycle, you would have testing for the new features, and you will have testing for the regression so that nothing else is broken. So it's easy to automate the regression test cases because you automate it once and you execute it every time. But with the new features, of course, you'll have to write the automation scripts again and again. But with this, it becomes easier for us to write the automation scripts even for the new features easily. And then, of course, you go to production. As a next step, okay, this is basically changing the cycle, sorry. Take a step forward. Using the automatic configuration tools and leveraging service virtualization, you can use tools such as, I've given the typical names over here, Chef and Puppet. We've done some POCs around this. So these tools actually help automate your entire, what I call, it's called different terms, there is no standard term for it, but environment management, which means a team or a set of people who are focused on just taking care of the environments, building the servers, taking care of the applications, and supporting those, typically in a non-production environment, right? So when they do more deployments than typical production support folks, when they are doing that, there's a lot of manual work and a lot of errors that happens, which again delays the whole cycle. So some of these tools can help to a great extent to build your standard environments, to push any changes. You just maintain one copy of your configurations, which is pushed out to all the servers. So it's not that, oh, it's working on this one, it's not working on this, right? And then you try to figure and compare all the files and figure out what's really going on. And another part is support a trunk-based development. This is very technical. I'll try to skip this right now. It's more to do with your configuration management. And if any of you have like, technical knowledge and want to talk to in detail, feel free to talk to me after this. I can talk about this in detail. And then further, we want to make sure that we are doing a proper backlog management. We're looking at behavior-driven development. And then we are also looking at adding the non-functional requirements to product backlog. So initially, in one of the examples, I mentioned that we look at the performance is a non-functional requirement, right? When you get a set of requirements for the features, you are not really looking at what is the performance. There are, of course, SLAs defined, but there are no specific requirements that come in. Maybe for an application, there are SLAs defined. The login page or the login cannot be more than 5 seconds, 10 seconds. But if you integrate this as a part of your user stories, as one of the non-functional requirements, at least the team is focusing on it upfront. Don't face the problems at a later stage. I have come across several scenarios where just because of the performance, the release gets delayed in the traditional cycle because you are testing it at way and not really thinking about it. Now, there are ways to implement the performance assurance framework. Again, in the traditional cycle where you do this, as one of the gentlemen mentioned, proper stakeholder management. But yes, this by design makes you do it. So that was the overall presentation. I just wanted to make it more interactive and wanted to also hear from everyone what are the experiences. How many of us over here have actually gone through the transformation from traditional cycle to one of the Agile or DevOps models? Okay, quite a lot though. Yeah, I see a lot of hands going up. Would you, sorry to put you on the spot, would you like sharing your experience? How?
I actually had a question on the first.
Oh, okay, so, sorry.
DevOps, are you speaking of a transformation from Agile to DevOps or of DevOps within an Agile framework, which was kind of how
So
I
it's
had
Agile
understood
to DevOps.
DevOps
So-
earlier?
Okay, so the overall way I look at it is if you want to go from your standard traditional cycle of development to DevOps, do it in 2 phases. First, go the Agile way, which is a midway, and then go further and do the DevOps model. So the first part I focused on was going to Agile, and then from there on go to DevOps. So this is the phase 2, and even within DevOps, there are multiple phases that I think would help. And Agile becomes a part of DevOps. So it's one of the, there are multiple tenets: test-driven development, behavioral-driven development, continuous integration, continuous delivery. So these are multiple tenets of DevOps. Agile is definitely one of them. So it becomes integral part of the whole process, DevOps process.
Hi, could you do me a favor and put back up the slide that had the points from the Agile Manifesto?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Which slide did you say?
That, bingo, right there.
Okay, yeah.
The Agile Manifesto.
Oh, the previous one?
Yeah, there we
Okay.
go. So you want the bullet points on the left, and you don't want the bullet points on the right in order to be agile. That was what they were saying in the manifesto. So I'm struggling because I'm finding something unsatisfying with having a lot of processes and plan and agile must be this in order to achieve agile, because it doesn't seem to square with the original intent of the Agile Manifesto. Could you speak to that?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. The last part you said?
It doesn't seem to square with the intent of the original Agile Manifesto, which is you're going to move out of having these rigid processes and having it must be done like this.
Okay, so there are definitely, the way it's looked at that is, it's called the guideline in a way, right? So when we talk about getting away from traditional processes, it's very hard-coded in terms of there are quality gates. If you look at each phase to other, there is a quality gate. Once you pass that on, you move on. Requirements, unless you baseline it, you cannot start with the design. Unless you finish the design, go to a project manager, says it's done, you cannot move forward, right? So essentially what Agile Manifesto says is you are looking at more of individual interactions over solid processes. It doesn't mean that you don't have any processes. You still need to define a guideline. People need to follow to that. And I have also seen the organizations come up with a hybrid approach for the processes and this, the traditional. So whatever traditional processes were there, people still try to identify what gates to apply in the Agile process, but it becomes difficult. If you are going purely Agile, you cannot do that. In a way, when we say working software over comprehensive documentation, so in a traditional approach, we are doing a big I have seen a high-level design, so to say, a huge document. You have another document which talks about low-level design, and you have the test cases and everything, right? What we are saying is, it's not that the documentation is not necessary, but the heavy templates and trying to fit into that particular template itself becomes difficult. So rather than that, do what makes sense, which is logical. It's not, you don't have to do documentation. And I have seen this excuse as well. When I asked some documents from some of the teams, they say, oh, we are agile, we don't document anything. That's still not right. There is still, but rather than doing a whole lot more, focus on what is important. Focus on the delivery. Focus on the product. So it's a philosophical thing rather than writing. You write only 2 documents. You write only 500 pages in a document. This is the principle that you should follow. This is more of a guiding principle. How you interpret it, it's kind of a maturity. Again, different organizations are at different level of maturity, so you would see things being done very differently across. But the basic principle is just focus on what is minimally required, focus on the features that are minimally required, focus on the processes that are minimally required, and that makes sense. And I think the team would come up with eventually what is it that really makes sense to them. And it's an evolutionary process when you make a change. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. So is it fair that to represent that? Is it fair to represent that? What you're presenting here was your solution to your set of constraints in your client's industry at your particular point in your evolution, not a one-size-fits-all template for everybody to do.
I would, yes and no. So quite a lot of it is derived from the experience I had, and it's not only my experience, it's our organization's experience. It's not, as I said, some of the things even I had doubts, but now I know how it's to be done, and it's based on the discussions with a lot of people. It's not just focused on one organization experience. I have talked to a lot of my peers across different organizations, looked at their problems, how they solved it. So it's a comprehensive way of looking at things, figuring out what made sense across different people. But yes, it's not something that if you go in an industry standard book or something, you will see the same thing. It's partly from experience, partly from other people's experience, partly from organizations' experience, and partly from the literature as well, whatever I could find. So it's a combination of most of the things. But examples I gave, yes, those were mostly from my experience. Yeah. Okay.
Agile and challenges. So if you have a sprint for 2 weeks, and I think you mentioned offshore. So what do you do when you have a sprint for 2 weeks and you have a very volatile offshore team? Because we all know that offshore people have a particularly high attrition rate. So how do you address those kind of challenges in Agile?
So one way, again, this is from my experience. What we have done is we typically identify core team members. We kind of divide the teams or form the teams in such a way that there are a set of core people, and 50% of them are approximately core. 50%, what I call them, is a flexible or a floating team. So we are in a position that if someone leaves, we are still able to retain that knowledge. And one of the other ways to, if you look at pure Agile format, what they say is, you shouldn't be people dependent. Everyone in the team should be able to do everything. So if you are following pure Agile, doesn't matter if someone leaves, because out of 7, if one person leaves, the other 6 are still able to do the same job. So that's where I said the individual responsibilities or roles are kind of getting blurred out with this approach. You are a tester, you're not a developer, doesn't work anymore. It's just probably, and it's an evolution process again. But that is a real challenge. When there is attrition, there is going to be some level of loss of knowledge. The new person comes in, your sprint velocity would reduce, your team's velocity would reduce at that time. But at the same time, if you form this core and a floating team approach, and it's more from your experience. You know core people are the people who are probably going to stick around. They have a little more experience. They are the ones who can drive the teams, help others out. You will not have rock stars in all the teams. You'll have few people who are really good at deliveries. Others are new or trying, need help. etc. And that's how you form your multiple pods. That's a recommendation I have. And there could be other solutions to that, but that's one I can think of. Yeah.
Again, going back to our friend's question on the agenda, if you go back there. Question to, not just for you, also the leaders of PMI here. Everything on the right side, it's interesting that you mentioned traditional, you never mentioned waterfall method at all. As it stands right now, everything on the right side defines PMI, PMBOK. Is it going to completely change the existing PMI practices, or is it going to stay for a while and then leave, or what are we looking at right now?
I think it's more for them to answer, the leaders over here, but my take, I still want to go home in one piece, so I cannot.
So I'll answer it from my perspective, not officially from the PMI perspective. So this is, for those of you who haven't met or heard me before, Larry, I'm the president of the PMI Dallas chapter. And kind of to my point before where he was talking about the stakeholder analysis in my perspective, right, not involving ops earlier on. So when I hear comments about this too much process, too much documentation, right, everybody has to remember the PMBOK is a guideline, right? There's no expectation that every project is doing every item that's outlined in the PMBOK, right? And one of the things I do on my projects, I'm the president of the PMI Dallas chapter, but I do use basically PMI's methodology. I don't even have PMI's Agile certification. I don't have anything against Agile. I just never needed it where I work. But I look at it, and if a particular document or too much process gets in the way of delivering my project, I don't do it. I don't. And Dell, where I work, they have their own methodology, which is very much aligned with PMI, and they love it, and they've gotten a trademark on it, right? So they're really proud of it, and my boss, believe it or not, he's not here, nor any of my peers here. Actually, he probably wouldn't even consider this a criticism, but he's way of a more PM geek than I am, to be quite honest with you, and he doesn't criticize me. We had a conversation about some communication planning tool that we have, that I was like, that thing's gonna take me 4 hours to fill out. There's no way I'm gonna fill it out. And I did a communication plan, I just didn't do that one, and he's fine with it, right? So to me, a good project manager looks at the processes and they use what makes sense, and they don't let it get in the way of delivering the project, right? And that's where Agile, I think, comes in, and they make a statement, they enforce it in the methodology. Let's look at what makes sense and enforce that. So when I hear a statement that the stuff on the right that Agile is supposed to be combating is anti-PMI, it's not, it's anti-bad project management. No. It's just my 2 cents.
That's a good answer.
Off my soapbox now. My phone's ringing. Oh, it's PMI.
Could I also add, since I'm here on behalf of the Project Management Institute and the Board of Directors, the PMBOK guide is not a methodology. Right. PMI does not have a prescribed methodology. It is the guide to the body of knowledge. Okay?
Well said. I think I don't need to respond on top of that. Yeah. No, but that was very well said. I think that is the truth in a way. Yeah. Yeah. And I am PMP certified. I am not Agile certified either. Would someone like to share their experience in the transformation? If gone through that, that would be really interesting to hear. Or any other questions? I am sure. You want to share something?
No, I just got a question, because I'm not an IT person,
Right.
okay? I agree with Larry, and I just get amazed at you IT guys. You get so hung up over all this stuff, which I consider, why, I mean, you should be asking the question, what does the project need, rather than saying, here's the methodology, now go cram it into it.
True. And, and I think that is where the new process methodology came in, but what you said is spot on. Essentially, we all as project managers necessarily need to look at what makes sense to deliver the project successfully over anything else. That's the bottom line. You look at any methodology, any process. I mean, even before there were formal processes, people had figured out how to go about anything that were done, right? We do take projects at our home. Do we really write or prepare anything? We just look at what needs to be done and we get it done.
When I was working on an agile project, we knew how to estimate with the waterfall.
Okay.
Then trying to go and size a project with a numerical value of 1 through 5, that was where we ran into the problem. Then we went to the hours, but then we had the problem with, well, the skill set, because something that might be 15 hours for one person would be 2 hours for one of the SMEs. So as a general rule, how do you size the story?
So it's the way I think it should work is depending on the comfort level of the team. And that's where the velocity, as we say, for each of the teams is different. And one of the ways I've seen, in fact, it is, I think, a couple of contracts I had seen that when we signed up a contract, it was typically that when we talk about a productivity gain, there's actually a measure that we need to, I cannot speak the number, but I would say by a certain percentage, our velocities should increase over a period of time. So to start with, there would be such problems, and that's where the transition is difficult. But as the team evolves, as different members in the team learn everything, they are interchangeable in their duties, these things would eventually go. So to start with, there is no easy way to start. Every one of us would come into face these problems. There's nothing, it's an evolutionary process, as I said. We need to learn through that, and that's why I chose this topic, because when you go through the transformation, I just didn't want to talk about Agile or DevOps. It's a transformation. So I wanted to focus on the transformation aspect, and it's not easy. I've been through multiple of these, and I've seen a lot of people go through that, and yeah, I mean, no answer to that. Only way is choose the right team members to start with and pass on the learnings from, starting in a slow manner. So maybe if you want say one particular application which has 100 team members, right? If you want to start off, maybe start with a small pod which can be logically separated out, use the learnings and apply to different agile pods and go in a slow manner. That way you will at least have learnings and you'll be able to mitigate some of that risk. But it's still mitigation, no avoidance. Sure, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I work for a software development professional services organization.
Okay.
So we get paid by external customers for the software we're developing.
Okay.
That means we have to sign a contract up front. That means we have to know how big it is, how much it's going to cost in order to remain profitable. How do you take an organization like that, where I have to know my cost, what am I going to charge the customer, because they've got their budgets that they've got to sign up to, into this sort of agile / DevOps whatever environment where scope and schedule seem to be fluid.
Right. And I face that, I work for a professional services company too. So I face that problem day in and day out. We just signed a contract which, so yes, and I have faced that problem. Okay, let me take another example. There was one recent contract where same thing happened. We had the scope identified up front, but the scope is more functional. And the idea was that we'll develop using whatever is in the framework right now, but that kept changing. Because since we were in an iterative process, so there was no functional scope change, but there was still technical scope change. And when you bring in a new technology, maybe the people would change, maybe the efforts would change and everything. So that is a challenge. One way that we have tried to mitigate it is, again, that's where partially hybrid approach, not a good way to go about it. But only way around that is to size the scope based on your experience, one thing. Use the function point analysis. Function point analysis still works nicely. And from a contractual perspective, you still need to ring fence your contract. That's all I would say. Make sure that this is the scope identified. This is the effort. You typically have the effort also identified, right? So, and it's more of a collaborative approach with the customer as well. They need to be confident about that what you are trying to do is this part, but if there is a change in that, this would happen. And another way is put in some buffer, saying that if at all there is a change, if we have less efforts, put a flexible budget over there. And there should be an agreement on that. So those are some from a contract perspective, I have suggestions, but there is no way to identify the scope. But again, at a high level, what I've seen is if you're talking about a large project, 5,000 hours, 10,000 hours, there won't be much change. But if you're talking about an 80 hours or 100 hours project, yes, there's no way around it. But if you're talking, you can still work around it to some extent. And one of the other things we do is negotiate. If you want to change this, can we remove that other change that we had planned earlier? Change that scope. So there has to be an agreement with the customer. You need to work very closely. Okay.
Some of the resources, you know, with Agile, Scrum methodologies, you can of course bring on a coach that has that's certified Scrum Master.
Right.
So what are you doing with DevOps? What are you doing to get people up to speed on it?
So two parts to that question, answer to that question. One is training for the mindset itself, because it requires a different mindset. Second part is some of the technical skills. And the technical skills I would like to classify, one, as you said, Scrum Masters. But apart from that, there are certain automation tools. So there is a huge focus on automation to reduce the cost, make it faster, et cetera, et cetera. For that, identify the tools that you want to use. Try to standardize it across the organization so you have some people who are able to help other teams out as well. But training is the only way to go on that. You need to train people on the automation. Mindset is a different training. Technical skills is a different training. And you need to do all that upfront. Again, start out slow. Don't do it big bang. Start out slow. Implement that proof of concept. So we typically, what my teams have done is, we want to do something, we need to implement a tool. So we implement it in phases. That's where if I can go to the previous slide, I said, do it in phases. Right? This is one, and over here I kind of said, go it in phases. But look, if you look at this, we start with Agile from the bottom. Go to continuous integration, so you have automated unit tests, you have automated builds and everything in place. And then you go all the way to continuous delivery and then bring in the operation. So do it in phases. And that's the way you will build those resource skills. You cannot just bring in new set of people. You'll need to train your existing people. And they need to be willing to learn. Oh yeah, there are coaches out there for this who would do the training for the process, and they would do the training for the different tools as well. If you go to the next one, there are some tools that I have listed, which are quite popular. Let's say Rally for managing the user stories and everything. You have JUnit for testing. You have Jenkins for automated builds, Sonar for code quality and all. So you integrate all of this stuff into that entire process. And that's where the automation and the other tools can come in. And these are just some of the tools. There are a lot of similar tools available as well. And I'm in no way endorsing these tools. Sure.
There are an awful lot of questions, and you have 20 minutes left. So maybe we could kind of let him get on through his presentation.
I'm done with the presentation.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay with that?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm done with the presentation, so that's fine. Okay.
I know you know what you have to cover, and you know what.
Yeah. I just had 5 or 6 slides. I like to talk more, put less on there.
These are great questions. So.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Repeat that, please.
So estimation, as I said, I mean, it's typically, we use the points instead of, so the question is, how does the estimation methodology change from traditional to Agile or DevOps? So essentially, we, instead of assigning the numbers, and that's where the concept of velocity comes in. So essentially, you tie up, if you want to do the traditional comparison, you see how many function points are you delivering per sprint, and what is your sprint velocity. That is how you do the comparison. But estimation changes in terms of you don't really look at the number of hours, but you look at the complexity. You are delivering, say, 80 user points or 80 story points in one sprint. Next sprint, so you compare with your baseline. You are running at 80, going over to 90. That's how you mature and progress. But there is no direct number of hours. Now, we still need to do budgeting. We still need to do, as you mentioned, contract, where you need to find the scope and hours and how much to charge. So for that, typically what we do is look at this. It's 2-week sprint. We look at how many sprints would be required. And based on that, just come up with the hours. That's how you do the budgeting aspect for that one. There's no other way around it, as far as I know. So it's still you identify the number of sprints. You know how many people are working and all that. That's how you translate it to hours. But eventually, as you mature, you deliver and more within the same budget, within the same time. So that's how you keep on improving. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Just maybe follow-up question.
Sure.
Have you seen, have you experienced by utilizing DevOps methodology to reducing the cost of hours?
So I didn't get it, sorry. Without using? I didn't hear the last couple of words.
No, I understand that you come up with a budget and estimation for overall project. By a given project, if you choose the traditional waterfall method versus Agile versus DevOps, do you see an overall budget estimation for the project?
We still need to do that, yes. Because typically the planning happens, there is an allocation of budget, business has a limited amount of money, so we still need to do that. Now, what I'm talking for is from services kind of company. If you are a product company, probably that would not be a problem, because essentially you're just trying to put in more features. You have a fixed team size, more or less, that you've decided. You need this many number of people. And at that point of time, all you're trying to do is just bring in new features, whatever that team can accommodate. So it depends on which industry you're looking at, what type of company. Is it a services company? Is it a product company? At what maturity level is that company, again, in its whole cycle? So depending on that, it would be different with different companies. There's, again, no standard way, I think.
So what are the costs versus the benefits of using DevOps? Basically, in Agile, you mentioned about all these tools, JUnit, Jenkins. So what is the cost of using these tools versus what are the benefits that one realizes if they use this DevOps process?
Quite a lot of these tools are open source. There are licensed and open source tools as well. So depending on how much you want to spend, you can either look at one. And some of these tools have both the versions. This is licensed as well as open source. You will probably have less features or no support, et cetera, available for that. So in terms of cost versus benefit, there is a huge difference. If implemented right and if you are able to reap all the benefits, I'm afraid to quote a number right now, I'm just thinking. But overall, I can say there is a great amount of operational efficiency because you are bringing in, from a production support perspective as well. Traditionally, we don't really think a lot about that. But there is a huge difference that you would see in operations because of the way you start integrating their work in here. In terms of time to market, as I said, you don't have to wait for entire set of features to go live. You can just do an incremental fit. Think of it this way as well. If you have a problem you identify, it's really easy when you have all the people responsible for that fix, for example, working in the single team. You're not dependent. Your resolution is much faster. When you have different teams, you have a business analyst team, you have a product owner team. If you have a single question in your development cycle, you'll go through multiple hoops to try to find that. I had one of my clients who was a director, And he said he was dependent on 11 different teams before he can start the development work. So that's the difference over here. So your day-to-day operations for development as well as your actual production operations for your application become much smoother and much faster. I can try to find out some numbers as well. What are the benefits that have been reaped? I think I have it somewhere in one of the slide decks. I'll have to look in and I can find out those numbers.
So one comment, one question. So some of these tools that are being used would be used whether it's typical development, waterfall, or agile. Some of them are agile specific tools, but not all.
Yes, some of them can definitely, so like continuous integration. Again, this is more of, because you're focusing on automation, these tools are mainly to automate the work, right? You can still use the same tools in your traditional cycle as well and do the automation. You will still see some benefits over there as well. It's not that if you go Agile or DevOps, then only you can use these tools. Quite a lot of them, most of them I think can be used over there as well. But then it's more of a tool approach than a philosophy approach. That's the difference between.
Agreed. And then if you're trying to price a project for a customer, I'm assuming then in order to do that estimate, you're going to have to have all your epics and user stories defined up front so that you can do that estimation, correct?
What we do typically is don't go to that level of details for a high-level estimation. Typically look at the overall scope and try to estimate based on that. Because if you try to segregate everything and you try to build the user stories up front, essentially we are losing the essence of it. What we mean is we are trying to learn from it. If there is something that we have found, we want to put that in the next sprint cycle. So if you plan way too far in advance, we are essentially losing the essence of the whole agile methodology over there. It's more of an iterative thing. So that is one of the challenges, of course, I agree. It's not that easy. You still need to do some estimation upfront, sometimes for customers, sometimes for budgeting purposes, and that is based on a high-level estimate with some variance in there.
Yeah, so you would need to plan for that in your planning.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Okay, 10 minutes to go. Okay, any other questions? I think we are finishing early. Okay, thank you very much.